Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It is my immense pleasure to welcome you all today to the International Climate Control Conference. And as we know, the climate control conversation has been going on for decades, but now there is a massive urgency to this. We are in the middle of a climate crisis, and we feel this urgency to do something finally. This is really the reality of where we are right now. We have to change. We simply have no choice. However, the choice that we do have is how we change. We need to be proactive in this change in order to ensure it's done our way, in a way that is still best for our collections. To avoid these sort of dramatic shocks that have us scrambling to figure out what to do, we need to start thinking about the future and about tomorrow. The good news, of course, is that we do have all of the information, tools, and resources that we need to change our climate control in a way that is still keeping to the highest conservation standards.
I've never been happier on a Zoom or on a panel than today. And this is really honest because I think really something can be actually done here. I think millions of tons of carbon can be saved. It's a kind of a moral authority, ethical authority, which comes from integrity. And integrity, in my opinion, is mostly a kind of strong overlap or strong cohesion between saying and doing. And I feel increasingly uncomfortable listening to give an institution, cultural institution, speak about, like climate change, climate crisis, sustainability, and at the same time, like they're producing air, they're producing heat with fossil fuels for me to listen to this message. And it's not necessarily, doesn't generate credibility, doesn't also generate authority. And to me, it's often more of the same in terms of like, we can all talk the talk, but can we walk the walk, right? Because I think that it's a dangerous position to speak without taking action. We really need, as a collective action, insurances, conservators, museum professionals need to say, okay, there was a game of telephone. This is not necessarily helpful. It can vary much more than plus minus 5 degrees. And we need to get our carbon emissions down. And, for doing the good deed, we'll even save some money. Putting climate control into perspective, that's not just an engineering thing, that it's not just a kind of simple misunderstanding, I think goes back to like climate control came in the 20th century, right? Like into museums. And the 20th century to me is similar, like the whole attitude of the 20th century is similar to like the attitude of a teenager. And now I think the 21st century is very much about the growing pains of moving out of this teen phase. We can't just behave like a kind of bratty teen and think, you don't have to put the dishes away. No, we actually have to kind of clean up, look what we're using, take out the garbage. And the 20th century was like, oh no, like we don't need to take out the garbage. And even if we do, it will be all fine. We don't even have to think about where that garbage is going, and that's an attitude which now the sustainability crisis, the climate crisis is showing us that we cannot afford this attitude. Climate control is then the pinnacle of a certain 20th century attitude, is that we've produced places of culture and culture only. We have to create places or institutions which are interwoven, that's a good word, I think, with everything that surrounds them.
We turn off 49% of all our climate system.
Wow.
And it has no effect. Yeah. It has no effect on the conditions in the galleries. We have energy consumption reduction of 10% of our total energy consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Many collections have been proof to wide climate fluctuations. They've seen everything, and any cracks that are going to form have formed. And the likelihood of you actually making these things more cracked is extremely low. Microenvironments, when you do a full risk analysis over 100 years, are the only thing that's going to give you total reliability.
Passive method we use, because sometimes, even if there may be a deterioration, because most of our objects are wooden objects and some bronzes too, it may be very, very negligible that we have not noticed it over many, many years. And I think that when one compares it with the impact of climate change and its effects and the carbon footprints, I think when you weigh the advantages and the disadvantages, I think this is a better option for us here to use the passive method, because the impact of climate change usually is disastrous.
So like other people, I've kind of questioned this idea of these ideal conditions, these magic numbers. We've known for a long time that ±4, ±5 was based on technological possibility, not object risk. So we know enough to dismiss this idea that ±5 is some kind of gold standard. We saw cases of institutions where conservators and registrars were both personally on board with broadening climate parameters in their institution, but each one assumed that the other would never agree to it. And of these themes of imagined conflict, imagined harmony, and professional humility demonstrate the adverse effects of relying on assumptions made about the intentions and desires of colleagues, needlessly preventing positive changes and mutually beneficial outcomes, with many, many people saying that they follow the industry standard, without being able to say where the numbers come from in their particular situation, or how they compare to up-to-date research.
If you ask scientists to look at the object and said whether the change is happening due to unstable climatic conditions, I can tell you that we will always find some change. Because if we go to the smaller and smaller and smaller scale, there is always some change. If you want to have no change, you have to have an object completely in the dark and 0 Kelvin and not any interaction at all. After all, we care very much about safety of our collections, and we need to make this change, but we need to make it in a safe and controllable way.
This 60/60 law led to big damage to collection as it was applied blindly in museums all over the world. When, in fact, Dr. Plopoulos Plendelis was proposing them only for museums in UK. Those rigorous levels were unattainable and dangerous. Of course, if we go back to climate control, the relative humidity level proposed in the literature for paper document are different in various countries. And is now flexible and takes into account the climatic curriculum vitae of the object and the local climatic condition. And if you see this is in the literature. In some country, paper is kept between 40 and 50. Other country because 45 and 65. Other country between 50 and 65. It is now flexible. And when is requested by an architect or somebody doing an exhibition, when it is requested at which level of relative humidity should I exhibited this type of object, whatsoever is the object, whatsoever is the material, the only answer immediate is I don't know. Because there are wood which are perfectly preserved until now at 50%, other at 80%, other at 30%. So please, when this question is put to you, be courageous enough to say, I need to know more. At this point, I cannot answer you. To conclude, climate control is only one aspect of preventive conservation, which covers 60 other causes of deterioration. Listen to nature. You will learn much more than ideas like this. Nature should show us the way.
A mark of professionalism has been to have ever more stringent standards, and it's often what I call a one-way ratchet. And professional culture, and it's not just conservators, it's collection managers and so on, everybody's trying to behave professionally, but when the professional direction around standards is one way, in other words, tighter standards, then that makes loans much more difficult. Actually, relaxing these standards will open up access to far more museums and possibly non-museum venues to actually take loans, which currently they're not able to do so, unless the museum, like ourselves or the Anchorage Museum decides to actually not impose those standards using its own collections in order to facilitate community loans. But the professional practice obviously is something that is far more rigid and out of date.
This idea of maybe acclimation standards rather than climate control standards might be a place to start a conversation.
I think also one of the things we really need as museum directors is to be honest with each other. So in-house standards are usually much lower than those demanded for loans. And we just need to be honest about that and say, actually, this stuff is fine without all of this rigid stuff. Imagine all the bureaucracy and expense, both in cash and carbon terms, we'd save if we were just honest about the conditions.
I think that honesty and transparency about our failures, if you can call them failures, our realities, is really important.
So a lot more collective commitment that is vocal, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Also, I think, one of the fears is that it's supposed to be a light switch and you can't talk about it until you're all the way there. And so I think being honest about what small things have been achieved too, or, what your local is, so that we can share knowledge and share steps and share tips without thinking that we have to have it all figured out before we can even discuss it.
I think there's a problem around professional culture. And I really, as I said, don't want to point the blame at conservators or collections managers. They're all doing their best, but there's a professional culture within museums which is very focused on peer group approval. And it's very difficult to break ranks and be particularly radical. Museum culture has not really professional culture has not really caught up with reality of the Earth crisis, where posterity is going to be a lot different. Yeah, as Julie said, values-based professional culture and the subcultures within different sectors within museums that really need to look at this. I don't think it's a technical issue primarily. We can achieve through good design of thick-walled buildings and showcases of relatively little air transfers and so on. We can find the conditions which will stabilize environments, but with some degree of fluctuation. It's this, as I said at the beginning, this one-way ratchet of professional culture that we need to address.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think it's ever technical, other than finding funds to change technical. Those are solvable problems. Really, it comes down to people and attitudinal barriers. Really, fear is the barrier.
We need to be unprofessional.
Love it. I love that.
In a really positive way.
I love that.
And I really liked it because it was a very provocative phrase, because it usually the last thing you'd ever want to be is unprofessional.
Heaven forbid, right?
Being unprofessional in this instance, when we know what we mean about professional culture being a hindrance, let's be less professional and more realistic and honest. We do have the power to make change. And I think we sometimes hold ourselves back.
Last spring, we really start the very serious conversation whether, we should really review in depth our temperature and relative humidity standards. So, what you can see in this diagram on the right side, it shows really our previous climate parameters. We are negotiating right now. We are explaining what we are doing this step, why we are making this decision. And I mean, we are very positive about the final outcome. And what we know for sure is that if there is any lender that insists that, previous older parameters need to be in place, this work will be removed from the checklist. And what we expect is to be able to save about 20,000 euros of cost every month by this, switch, this change of parameters.
Experience, and not just experience, but I'm not sure if I'm going to use the right word, but boldness counts. So we should have more self-confidence that we are progressing. Now, the climate changes, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the And the problems the society is living now because of the very dramatic climate issues and accidents and problems that we are all living, it's more pressing this, but it's still taking a long time, since we are talking about this, at least since 2002, it's been 20 years already since we are talking, and we still see museum directors, lenders, and several actors within this ecosystem still pursuing strict climate conditions. I think that boldness,
I love
that's
that.
the word boldness. I mean, we need to be a little bit more bold.
Number one, it's no longer a question about whether we should broaden parameters in consideration of the climate crisis. The climate emergency is our top priority. And without doing everything we can to mitigate the climate emergency, we will have no collections or communities left to engage with.
Change is not about compromise. We're not making changes because at the expense of our collections, but actually we're just moving towards better collections care practices if we move towards more bespoke conditions. Everybody really is on the same page with this, and that we really are ready to make some change.